Section 11 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 2, Jewish Heroes and Prophets, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Solomon, Part 1. The Glory of the Monarchy, about 993 to 953 B.C. We associate with Solomon the culmination of the Jewish monarchy, and a reign of unexampled prosperity and glory. He not only surpassed all his predecessors and successors in those things which strike the imagination as brilliant and imposing, but he had such extraordinary intellectual gifts that he has passed into history as the wisest of ancient kings and one of the most favored of mortals. Amid the evils which saddened the latter days of his father David, this remarkable man grew up. His interests were protected by his mother Bathsheba, an intriguing, ambitious, and beautiful woman, and his education was directed by the prophet Nathan. He was 10 years of age when his elder brother Absalom rebelled, and a youth of 15 to 20 when he was placed upon the throne, during the lifetime of his father and with his sanction, aided by the cabals of his mother, the connivance of the high priest Zadok, the spiritual authority of Nathan, and the political ascendency of Benaiah, the most valiant of the captains of Israel after Joab. He became king in a great national crisis, when unfilial rebellion had undermined the throne of David, and Adonijah, next in age to Absalom, had sought to steal the royal scepter, supported by the veteran Joab and Abiathar, the elder high priest. Solomon's first acts as monarch were to remove the great enemies of his father and the various heads of faction, not sparing even Joab, the most successful general that ever brought luster on the Jewish arms. With Abiathar, who died in exile, expired the last glory of the house of Eli, and with Shimei, who was slain with Adonijah, passed away the last representative of the royal family of Saul. Soon after, Solomon repaired to the heights of Gibeon, 6 miles from Jerusalem, a lofty eminence which overlooks Judea, and where stood the tabernacle of the congregation, the original tent of the wanderings, in front of which was the brazen altar on which the young king, as a royal holocaust, offered the sacrifice of 1,000 victims. It was on the night of that sacrificial offering that in a dream a divine voice offered to the youthful king whatsoever his heart should crave. He prayed for wisdom, which was granted, the first evidence of which was his celebrated judgment between the 2 women who claimed the living child, which made a powerful impression on the whole nation and doubtless strengthened his throne. The kingdom which Solomon inherited was probably at the time the most powerful in Western Asia, the fruit of the conquests of Saul and David, of Abner and Joab. It was bounded by Lebanon on the north, the Euphrates on the east, Egypt on the south, and the Mediterranean on the west. Its territorial extent was small compared with the Assyrian or Persian Empire, but it had already defeated the surrounding nations, the Philistines, the Edomites, the Syrians, and the Ammonites. It hemmed in Phoenicia on the seacoast, and controlled the great trade routes to the east, which made it politic for the king of Tyre to cultivate the friendship of both David and Solomon. If Palestine was small in extent, it was then exceedingly fertile, and sustained a large population. Its hills were crested with fortresses, and covered with cedars and oaks. The land was favorable to both tillage and pasture, abounding in grapes, figs, olive, dates, and every species of grain. The numerous springs and streams favored a perfect system of irrigation, so that the country presented a picture in striking contrast to its present blasted and dreary desolation. The nation was also enriched by commerce as well as by agriculture. Caravans brought from eastern cities the most valuable of their manufactures. From Tarshish in Spain ships brought gold and silver. Egypt sent chariots and fine linen. Syria sold her purple cloths and robes of varied colors. Arabia furnished horses and costly trappings. All the luxuries and riches which Tyre had collected in her warehouses found their way to Jerusalem. Even silver was as plenty as the stone in the streets. Long voyages to the mouth of the Indus resulted in a vast accumulation of treasure, gold, ivory, spices, gums, perfumes, and precious stones. The nations and tribes subject to Solomon from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, and from Syria to the Red Sea, paid a fixed tribute, while their kings and princes sent rich presents, vessels of gold and silver, costly arms and armor, rich garments and robes, horses and mules, perfumes and spices. But the prosperity of the realm was not altogether inherited. It was firmly and prudently promoted by the young king. Solomon made alliances with Egypt and Syria, as well as with Phoenicia, and in peace and plenty enriched all classes, so that every man sat under his own vine and fig tree in perfect security. Never was such prosperity seen in Israel before or since. Strong fortresses were built on Lebanon to protect the caravans, and Tadmor in the wilderness to the east became a great center of trade, and ultimately a splendid city under Zenobia. The royal stables contained 40,000 horses and 1,400 chariots. The royal palace glistened with plates of gold, and the parks and gardens were watered from immense reservoirs. When the youthful monarch repaired to these gardens in his gorgeous chariot, he was attended, says Stanley, by nobles whose robes of purple floated in the wind, and whose long black hair, powdered with gold dust, glistened in the sun, while he himself, clothed in white, blazing with jewels, scented with perfumes, wearing both crown and sceptre, presented a scene of gladness and glory. When he traveled, he was borne on a splendid litter of precious woods, inlaid with gold and hung with purple curtains, preceded by mounted guards, with princes for his companions and women for his idolaters, so that all Israel rejoiced in him. We infer that Solomon reigned for several years in justice and equity, without striking faults, a wise and benevolent prince who feared God and sought from him wisdom, which was bestowed in such a remarkable degree that princes came from remote countries to see him, including the famous Queen of Sheba, who was both dazzled and enchanted. Yet, while he was, on the whole, loyal to the God of his fathers, and was the pride and admiration of his subjects, especially for his wisdom and knowledge, Solomon was not exempted from grave mistakes. He was scarcely seated on his throne before he married an Egyptian princess, doubtless with the view of strengthening his political power. But while this splendid alliance brought wealth and influence, and secured chariots and horses, it violated one of the settled principles of the Jewish commonwealth, and prevented that isolation which was so necessary to keep uncorrupted from the manners and habits of the people. The alliance doubtless favored commerce, and in one sense enlarged the minds of his subjects, removing from them many prejudices. But the nation was not intended by the divine Founder to be politically or commercially great, but rather to preserve the worship of Jehovah. Moreover, the daughter of Pharaoh was an idolater, and her influence, so far as it went, tended to wean the king from his religious duties, at least to make him tolerant of false gods. The enlargement of the king's harem was another mistake, for although polygamy was not condemned, and was practiced even by David, it made Solomon prominent among Eastern monarchs for an absurd ostentation, allied with enervating effeminacy, and thus gradually undermined the healthy tone of his character. It may have prepared the way for the apostasy of his later years, and certainly led to a great increase of the royal expenses. The support of 700 wives and 300 concubines must have been a scandal and a burden for which the nation was not prepared. The pomp in which he lived presupposes a change in the government itself, even to an absolute monarchy and a grinding despotism, fatal to the liberties which the Israelites had enjoyed under Saul and David. The predictions and warnings of Samuel were realized for the first time in the reign of Solomon, so that wealth, prosperity, and luxury were but a poor exchange for that ancient religious ardor and intense patriotism which had led the Hebrew nation to victory over surrounding idolatrous nations. The heroic ages of Jewish history passed away when ships navigated by Phoenician sailors brought gold from Ophir and silver from Tarshish, and did not return until the Maccabees rallied and hunted the decimated tribes of Israel against the armies of the Syrian kings. Solomon's peaceful and prosperous reign of 40 years was, however, favorable to one grand enterprise which David had longed to accomplish, but to whom it was denied. This was the building of the Temple, for so long a time identified with the glory of Jerusalem, and common interest in which might have bound the 12 tribes together but for the excessive taxation which the extravagance and ostentation of the monarch had rendered necessary. We can form but an inadequate idea of the magnificence of this temple from its description in the sacred annals. An edifice which taxed the mighty resources of Solomon and consumed the spoils of 40 years' successful warfare might have been in that age without parallel in splendor and beauty. If the figures are not exaggerated, it required the constant labors of 10,000 men in the mountains of Lebanon alone to cut down and hew the timber, and this for a period of 11 years. Of ordinary laborers there were 70,000, and of those who worked in the quarries and squared the stones there were nearly 80,000 more, besides overseers. It took 3 years to prepare the foundations. As Mount Moriah, on which the temple was built, did not furnish level space enough, a wall of solid masonry was erected on the eastern and southern sides nearly 300 feet in height, the stones of which in some instances were more than 20 feet long and 6 feet thick, so perfectly squared that no mortar was required. The buried foundations for the courts of the temple and the vast treasure houses still remain to attest the strength and solidity of the work, seemingly as indestructible as are the pyramids of Egypt, and only paralleled by the uncovered ruins of the palaces of the Caesars on the Palatine Hill at Rome, which fill all travelers with astonishment. Vast cisterns also had to be hewn in the rocks to supply water for the sacrifices, capable of holding 10 millions of gallons. The temple proper was small compared with the Egyptian temples, or with mediaeval cathedrals, but the courts which surrounded it were vast, enclosing a quadrangle larger than the area on which St. Peter's Church at Rome is built. It was, however, the richness of the decorations and of the sacred vessels and the altars for sacrifice, which consumed immense quantities of gold, silver, and brass, that made the temple especially remarkable. The treasures alone which David collected were so enormous that we think there must be errors in the calculation. 13,000,000 pounds Troy of gold and 127,000,000 pounds of silver, an amount not easy to estimate. But the plates of gold which overlaid the building, and the cherubim or symbolical winged figures, the precious woods, the rich hangings and the curtains of crimson and purple, the brazen altars, the lamps, the sacred vessels of solid gold and silver, the elaborate carvings and castings, the rare gems, these all together must have required a greater expenditure than is seen in the most famous temples of Greece or Asia Minor, whose value and beauty chiefly consisted in their exquisite proportions, in their marble pillars and figures of men or animals. But no representation of man, no statue to the Deity, was seen in the Temple of Solomon. No idol or sacred animal profaned it. There was no symbol to indicate even the presence of Jehovah, whose dwelling place was in the heavens, and whom the heaven of heavens could not contain. There were rites and sacrifices, but these were offered to an unseen divinity, whose presence was everywhere, and who alone reigned as King of kings and Lord of lords forever and ever. The temple, however, with its courts and porticos, its vast foundations of stone squared in distant quarries, and the immense treasures everywhere displayed, impressed both the senses and the imagination of a people never distinguished for art or science. And not only so, but Ferguson says, the whole Mohammedan world look to it as the foundation of all architectural knowledge, and the Jews still recall its glories and sigh over their loss with a constant tenacity unmatched by that of any other people to any other building of the ancient world. Whether or not we are able to explain the architecture of the temple, or are in error respecting its size, or the amount of gold and silver expended, or the number of men employed, we know that it was the pride and glory of that age, and was large enough, with its enclosures, to contain a representation of 5 millions of people, the heads of all the families and tribes of the nation, such as were collected together at its dedication. As the great event of David's reign was the removal of the ark to Jerusalem, so the culminating glory of Solomon was the dedication of the temple he had built to the worship of Jehovah. The ceremony equaled in brilliancy the glories of a Roman triumph, and infinitely surpassed them in popular enthusiasm. The whole population of the kingdom, some 4 or 5 millions, or their picked representatives, came to Jerusalem to witness or to take part in it. And as the long array of dignitaries, with thousands of musicians clothed in white, and the monarch himself arrayed in pontifical robes, and the royal household in embroidered mantles, and the guards with their golden shields, and the priests bearing the sacred but tattered tabernacle, with the ark and the cherubim and the altar of sacrifice, and the golden candlesticks and table of shewbread, and the brazen serpent of the wilderness, and the venerated tables of stone on which were engraved by the hand of God himself the 10 Commandments. As this splendid procession swept along the road, strewed with flowers and fragrant with incense, how must the hearts of the people have been lifted up! Then the royal pontiff arose from the brazen scaffold on which he had seated himself, and amid clouds of incense and the smoke of burning sacrifice offered unto God the tribute of national praise, and implored his divine protection. And then, rising from his knees, with hands outstretched to the heaven, he blessed the congregation, saying with a loud voice, "Let the Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers, so that all the earth may know that Jehovah is God, and that there is none else." Then followed the sacrifices for this grand occasion. 20,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep and goats were offered up on successive days. Only a portion of these animals was actually consumed on the altar by the officiating priests; the greater part furnished meat for the assembled multitude. The festival of the dedication lasted a week, and this was succeeded by the Feast of the Tabernacles, and from that time the Temple became the pride and glory of the nation. To see it periodically and worship in its courts became the intensest desire of every Hebrew. 3 times a year some great festival was held, attended by a vast concourse of the people. The command was that every male Israelite should appear before the Lord and make his offering; but this of course had its necessary exceptions, as multitudes of women and children could not go, and had to be cared for at home. We cannot easily understand how on any other supposition they were all accommodated, spacious as were the various courts of the Temple, and we conclude that only a large representation of the tribes and families took place, for how could 4 or 5 millions of people assemble together at any festival? Contemporaneous with the building of the Temple, or immediately after it was dedicated, were other gigantic works, including the royal palace, which it took 13 years to complete, and upon which, as upon the sacred house, Syrian artists and workmen were employed. The principal building was only 150 feet long, 75 feet broad, and 45 feet high, and 3 stories, with a grand porch supported on lofty pillars. But connected with the palace were other edifices to support the magnificence in which the king lived with his court and his harem. Around the tower of the house of David were hung the famous golden shields, 1,000 in number, which had been made for the bodyguard, with other glittering ornaments which were likened by the poets to the neck of a bride decked with rays of golden coins. In the great judgment hall, built of cedar and squared stone, was the throne of the monarch, made of ivory inlaid with gold. A special mansion was erected for Solomon's Egyptian queen, of squared stones 12 to 15 feet in length. Connected with these various palaces were extensive gardens constructed at great expense, filled with all the triumphs of horticultural art, and watered by streams from vast reservoirs. In these the luxurious king and court could wander among beds of spices and flowers and fruits. But these did not content the royal family. A summer palace was erected on the heights of Mount Lebanon, having gardens filled with everything which could delight the eye or captivate the senses. Here, surrounded with learned men, women, and courtiers, with bands of music, costly litters, horses, and chariots, and every luxury which unbounded means could command, the magnificent monarch beguiled his leisure hours, abandoned equally to pleasure and study; for his inquiring mind sought to master all the knowledge that was known, especially in the realm of natural history, since he was wiser than all men, and spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is on Lebanon even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. We can get some idea of the expenses of his household in the fact that it daily consumed 60 measures of flour and meal, and 30 oxen and 100 sheep, besides venison, game, and fatted fowls. The king never appeared in public except with crown and scepter, in royal robes redolent of the richest perfumes of India and Arabia, and sparkling with gold and gems. He lived in a constant blaze of splendor, whether traveling in his gorgeous litter, surrounded with his guards, or seated on his throne to dispense justice and equity, or feasting with his nobles to the sound of joyous music. To keep up this regal splendor, to support 700 wives and 300 concubines on the fattest of the land, and deck them all in robes of purple and gold, to build magnificent palaces, to dig canals, and construct gigantic reservoirs for parks and gardens, to maintain a large standing army in time of peace, to erect strong fortresses wherever caravans were in danger of pillage, to found cities in the wilderness, to level mountains and fill up valleys, to accomplish all this even the resources of Solomon were insufficient. What were 666 talents of gold yearly received $35,000,000, besides the taxes on all merchants and travelers, and the vast gifts which flowed from kings and princes, when that constant drain on the royal treasury is considered? Even a Louis XIV. Was impoverished by his court and palace building, though he controlled the fortunes of 25 millions of people. King Solomon in all his glory became embarrassed, and was obliged to make forced contributions, to levy a heavy tribute on his own subjects from Dan to Beersheba, and make bondmen of all the people that were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The people were virtually enslaved to aggrandize a single person. The burdens laid on all classes and the excessive taxation at last alienated the nation. The division of the whole country into 12 revenue districts was a serious grievance, especially as the high official over each could make large profits from the excess of contributions demanded. A poll tax, from which the nation in the olden times was freed, was levied on Israelite and Canaanite alike. The virtual slave labor by which the great public improvements were made sapped the loyalty of the people and produced discontent. This forced labor was as fatal as war to the real property of the nation, for wealth is ever based on private industry, on farms and vineyards, rather than on the palaces of kings. Moreover, the friendly relations which Solomon established with the neighboring heathen nations disgusted the old religious leaders, while the tendency to Oriental luxury which outward prosperity favored alarmed the more thoughtful. It was not a pleasant sight for the princes of Israel to see the whole land overrun with Phoenicians, Arabs, Babylonians, Egyptians, caravan drivers, strangers, and travelers, camels and dromedaries from Midian and Sheba, traders to the fairs, peddlers with their foreign cloths and trinkets, all spreading immorality and heresy, and filling the cities with strange customs and degrading dances. Nor was there in that absolute monarchy which Solomon centralized around his throne any remedy for all this save assassination or revolution. The king had become debauched and effeminate. The love of pomp and extravagance was followed by worldliness, luxury, and folly. From agricultural pursuits the people had passed to commercial. The Israelites had become merchants and traders, and the foul idolatries of Phoenicians and Syrians had overspread the land. The king having lost the respect and affection of the nation, the rebellion of Jeroboam was a logical sequence. I have not read of any king who so belied the promises of his early days, and on whom prosperity produced so fatal an apostasy as Solomon. With all his wisdom and early piety, he became an egotist, a sensualist, and a tyrant. What vanity he displayed before the Queen of Sheba! What a slave he became to wicked women! How disgraceful was his toleration of the gods of Phoenicia and Egypt! How hard was the bondage to which he subjected his subjects! How different was his ordinary life from that of his illustrious father, with no repentance, no remorse, no self abasement! He was a Nebuchadnezzar and a Sardanapalus combined, going from bad to worse. And he was not only a sensualist and a tyrant, an egotist, and to some extent an idolater, but he was a cynic, skeptical of all good, and of the very attainments which had made him famous. We read of no illustrious name whose glory passed through so dark an eclipse. The satiated, disenchanted, disappointed monarch, prematurely old and worn out by self indulgence, passed away without honor or regret at the age of 60, and was buried in the city of David, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. The Christian fathers and many subsequent theological writers have puzzled their brains with unsatisfactory speculations whether Solomon finally repented or not, but the Scriptures are silent on that point. We have no means of knowing at what period of his life his heart was weaned from the religion of David, or when he entered upon a life of pleasure. There are some passages in the book of Ecclesiastes which lead us to suppose that before he died he came to himself, and was a preacher of righteousness. This is the more charitable and humane view to take. Yet even so his moral teachings and warnings are not imbued with the personal contrition that endeared David's soul to God. They are unimpassioned, cold-hearted, intellectual, impersonal. Moreover, it may be that even in the midst of his follies he retained the perception of moral distinctions. His will was probably enslaved, so that he had not the power to restrain his passions, and his head may have become so giddy in his high elevation. How few men could have resisted such powerful temptations as assailed Solomon on every side! The heart of the Christian world cannot but feel that so gifted a man, endowed with every intellectual attraction, who reigned for a time with so much wisdom, who recognized Jehovah as the guide and Lord of Israel, as especially appears at the dedication of the temple, and who wrote such profound lessons of moral wisdom, would not be suffered to descend to the grave without the divine forgiveness. All that we know is that he was wise, and favored beyond all precedent, but that he adopted the habits and fell in with the vices of Oriental kings, and lost the affections of his people. He was exalted to the highest pinnacle of glory; he descended into an abyss of shame, a sad example of the infirmity of human nature which all ages will lament. End of Section 11.